October 24th, 1944, 10:32 a.m. The Sibuyan Sea. A 500-pound bomb slams into the deck of the super battleship Musashi at 600 miles per hour. Steel plates buckle. Fire erupts through 3 decks. 16 men are vaporized before they hear the explosion. The blast throws debris 200 feet into the air, while a second bomb is already screaming down, punching through the flight deck armor the Japanese engineers swore was unbreakable. Below deck, a torpedo tears into the port hull with a sound like God-ripping sheet metal. Water floods compartment after compartment. Damage control teams sprint through corridors, filling with smoke and seawater, dragging wounded men past bodies that no longer resemble anything human. And on the bridge of the Yamato, 300 yards ahead, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita grips the railing and watches wave after wave after wave of American aircraft fill the sky in numbers that make zero sense. 4 carriers. His intelligence briefing said 4 carriers, maybe 5. That was what the Americans had in Philippine waters. 4 or 5 Essex-class fleet carriers, organized into 2 task groups, manageable, beatable. That was what every admiral, every intelligence officer, every war planner in the Imperial Japanese Navy had told him before this mission began. But the aircraft keep coming. Dozens in the first wave, dozens more in the second, then a third wave before the first wave even finishes its attack runs. Kurita counts. He calculates. 4 carriers can launch maybe 60 aircraft in a full strike. 5 carriers, maybe 75. He is watching over 100 aircraft attack simultaneously with more on the horizon. Either American carriers have developed some supernatural ability to multiply aircraft in midair, or everything Kurita has been told about enemy strength is a lie. It is a lie, and 19,000 sailors across 23 Japanese warships are about to pay for it with their lives. But this story does not begin in the burning waters of the Sibuyan Sea. It begins 3 years earlier, in a place no Japanese admiral ever visited, with a man no Japanese intelligence officer ever heard of. A 60-year-old shipbuilder from New York State named William Francis Gibbs, who had never built a warship in his life. And his crazy rejected laugh at idea would produce more aircraft carriers than the entire Japanese Navy believed was physically possible. To understand why Gibbs mattered, you need to understand what the world looked like in early 1942. Japan was winning. Not just winning, dominating. In 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had conquered an empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Their carrier force was the finest in the world. 6 fleet carriers crewed by pilots who had been training for a decade. Pilots who could put a torpedo into a moving ship from angles that American aviators considered suicide runs. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, Japanese forces sank 5 Allied cruisers and 5 destroyers in 7 hours. At the Indian Ocean Raid, in April 1942, Japanese carriers under Admiral Nagumo struck British bases at Ceylon, sinking 1 carrier, 2 cruisers, and 23 merchant ships. The Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet on Earth for 3 centuries, retreated to East Africa rather than face Japanese carriers again. The message was clear. Japanese carrier aviation was the most lethal weapon system on the planet, and nobody had an answer for it. America's answer was supposed to be the Essex-class, a new fleet carrier design approved before the war, displacing 27,000 tons, carrying 90 aircraft capable of 33 knots. On paper, the Essex-class was everything the Navy needed. Fast, tough, packed with aircraft. But paper does not sink battleships. Steel sinks battleships. And in early 1942, America had exactly 0 Essex-class carriers in service. The first one, USS Essex herself, was still months from completion at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. The shipyard was working as fast as it could, but carrier construction was brutally complex. 15,000 tons of steel plate and structural steel, propulsion machinery generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, hangar decks, aviation fuel storage ordnance magazines, aircraft elevators, arresting gear catapults. Every system had to work perfectly, or pilots died on their own flight deck. Japanese naval architects knew exactly how hard it was to build fleet carriers. They had spent 4 years building the Taiho, their most advanced carrier design. 4 years from keeling to commissioning. Their intelligence estimates applied that same timeline to American construction. If the Americans laid down 6 Essex-class carriers in 1941 and 1942, the first batch would commission in 1945 or 1946. By then, Japan planned to have fortified its defensive perimeter so thoroughly that even a dozen American carriers could not break through. That assumption was about to be demolished by a stubborn old man who built ships like Henry Ford built automobiles. William Francis Gibbs was not a naval officer. He was not an engineer by formal training. He was a lawyer turned ship designer who had spent 30 years obsessing over one single idea. Ships were built too slowly, because shipyards treated every vessel as a unique creation, crafted by hand one frame at a time, by skilled workers who passed their knowledge down like medieval guild secrets. Gibbs believed ships could be built the way factories built machines. Standardized parts, prefabricated sections, assembly line methods. Break the ship into modules, build the modules simultaneously in different locations, then bolt and weld them together at the shipyard. The Navy thought this was insane. Warships were not automobiles. You could not stamp out a flight deck like a car hood. Carrier construction required precision that mass production methods could not achieve. Welding, which Gibbs insisted should replace riveting wherever possible, was considered unreliable for warship hulls. Riveted joints were proven. Welded joints cracked under stress. Every senior naval constructor in Washington said the same thing. Gibbs was a civilian who did not understand military shipbuilding. His ideas would produce floating coffins, not fighting ships. Gibbs did not care what they thought. He had an ally who mattered more than every admiral in the Navy combined. Henry Kaiser, the man who had already applied mass production methods to cargo ship construction and reduced Liberty ship build times from 6 months to 6 weeks. Kaiser's methods were crude by naval standards, but devastatingly effective. His Richmond shipyard in California was launching a new cargo ship every single day using prefabricated sections, welded together by workers who had been waitresses and farmhands 6 months earlier. The partnership between Gibbs and Kaiser did not produce Essex-class carriers directly. Kaiser's yards built escort carriers, the smaller, slower, cheaper cousins of fleet carriers. But the methods they pioneered spread like wildfire through America's naval shipyards. Newport News Shipbuilding, the primary Essex-class builder, watched Kaiser's prefabrication techniques cut cargo ship construction times by 80% and made a decision that would change the war. They adapted those techniques to carrier construction. Instead of building an Essex-class carrier from the keel up one frame at a time, Newport News broke the carrier into major sections: hull modules, propulsion units, internal compartment blocks. Each section was built simultaneously in specialized assembly buildings, scattered across the shipyard. Welding crews worked on hull plates in Building A, while electricians wired propulsion control panels in Building C, while pipe fitters assembled fuel systems in Building D. When all sections reached completion, massive cranes moved them to the shipway where they were assembled like pieces of a vast steel puzzle. The results were staggering. USS Essex, the first of her class, took 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. That was already faster than Japanese intelligence believed possible. But the next carriers came faster. USS Yorktown commissioned in 16 months, USS Hornet in 15 months, USS Franklin in 13 months. Each carrier built faster than the last, as workers refined techniques, eliminated bottlenecks, and memorized assembly sequences until they could weld hull sections in their sleep. And here is the detail that would have made Japanese admirals physically ill if they had known it. America was not building these carriers one at a time. 5 shipyards were building Essex-class carriers simultaneously. Newport News in Virginia, Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Pennsylvania, Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, Bethlehem Steel's Four River Shipyard in Massachusetts. 5 shipyards each, completing a carrier every 14 to 18 months, meant the United States was commissioning a new fleet carrier approximately every 8 weeks. 1 carrier every 8 weeks, while Japan struggled to complete 1 carrier every 2 years. By mid-1943, 6 Essex-class carriers were operational. By early 1944, 12. Japanese intelligence detected some of these carriers through reconnaissance photographs and radio intercepts, but they could not believe the numbers. Their reports kept revising upward. 4 carriers confirmed, then 8, then 12. Each revision was treated as catching up to reality, not as evidence that reality was accelerating beyond comprehension. Captain Toshikazu Omai of the Combined Fleet Staff was one of the few Japanese officers who sensed the danger. He had studied American industrial capacity before the war. He understood the steel production figures, the shipyard numbers, the labor force statistics. In August 1942, after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Omai received reconnaissance reports showing more American carriers near Guadalcanal than intelligence estimates accounted for. He drafted a memorandum warning that American carrier construction appeared to be proceeding faster than projected. If the trend continued, American carrier strength would grow beyond Japan's ability to counter through attrition. The memorandum was read. It was filed. It was dismissed. Intelligence officers explained that American shipyards were simply using existing capacity efficiently. There was no evidence of revolutionary construction methods. Even if the Americans built 10 or 12 Essex-class carriers, total those carriers would be spread across 2 oceans. Atlantic convoy protection, European theater operations, and Pacific deployments would dilute American strength to manageable numbers in any single battle. No task force would face more than 4 or 5 carriers at once. This assumption was built on a fatal error. The Japanese were projecting their own limitations onto an enemy that operated under completely different rules. Japan could never concentrate all its carriers because its empire was too vast and its carrier force too small. They assumed America faced the same constraint. They did not understand that when you have enough carriers, you can concentrate overwhelming force in one theater, while still maintaining strength everywhere else. In January 1944, 6 American carriers struck Japan's most important forward base. 6 carriers in one operation destroyed 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, over 30 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons. 6 carriers concentrated in one place, while other American carriers continued operations in other theaters. That should have been the alarm bell. 6 carriers at Truk meant total American carrier strength was far higher than estimates suggested, because you cannot send 6 to one location unless you have many more covering everything else. The alarm bell rang. Nobody answered. And now the clock ticks toward October 1944, toward Leyte Gulf, toward the moment Vice Admiral Kurita will stand on the bridge of the Yamato, watching 250 American aircraft tear his fleet apart in a single afternoon, and realize that everything he was told about enemy carrier strength was not just wrong, but wrong by a factor of 3 to 1. But the attacks on Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea are only the beginning, because the Americans do not have 13 carriers in Philippine waters, as updated reconnaissance will desperately report that evening. They have 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, plus light carriers, plus escort carriers, organized into the most powerful naval armada ever assembled in human history. And in Part 2, we will see what happens when that armada unleashes its full fury, when the decoy operation collapses, when Kurita emerges from San Bernardino Strait at dawn to find 6 tiny escort carriers standing between his battleships and the American invasion fleet, and when those 6 tiny carriers do something so unbelievably brave that Japanese officers who witnessed it refuse to believe the reports for the rest of their lives. The question is not whether Kurita will turn back. The question is what he will see in those final hours that convinces a veteran admiral with 4 battleships, including the largest warship ever built, that fighting is no longer possible against an enemy that builds carriers the way other nations build trucks. In Part 1, a stubborn shipbuilder named William Francis Gibbs and his alliance with Henry Kaiser introduced mass production methods to carrier construction the Japanese admirals believed were impossible. 5 American shipyards began building Essex-class carriers, simultaneously cutting construction time from 20 months to 13 months per ship. By early 1944, 12 fleet carriers were operational, and the number was climbing. But building carriers fast was only half the problem. The other half was convincing the men who ran the United States Navy that these ships could actually fight. And that is where everything nearly fell apart. Because in the summer of 1943, the most powerful man in American naval aviation wanted to kill the entire program. Vice Admiral John S. McCain Sr. was not a man who tolerated fools. He had earned his naval aviator wings at age 52, the oldest man in American history to complete flight training. He had commanded carrier operations in the South Pacific during the darkest days of Guadalcanal. He had watched friends die on carrier decks that buckled under Japanese bombs. And when he reviewed the training reports from the first batch of Essex-class carriers entering service, he saw a disaster waiting to happen. The crews were green, not just inexperienced, dangerously catastrophically green. USS Essex had commissioned in December 1942, with a crew where 60% of enlisted men had never been to sea. Her air group included pilots who had fewer than 300 flight hours, half the minimum Japanese carrier pilots accumulated before deployment. Deck crews fumbled aircraft, handling procedures that veteran sailors performed in their sleep. During early training exercises, Essex suffered 3 deck crashes in 1 week. Aircraft missed arresting wires and slammed into barriers. A fuel leak during refueling operations nearly caused an explosion that would have crippled the ship before she ever saw combat. McCain read these reports and reached a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the Navy Department. The Essex-class carriers were being built too fast. Construction had outpaced the Navy's ability to train crews. Sending these ships into combat with untrained men was not bold strategy. It was murder. McCain recommended slowing carrier commissioning to match crew training capacity. That meant cutting production from 1 carrier every 8 weeks to 1 carrier every 4 months. It meant telling Newport News and Brooklyn Navy Yard and Philadelphia to lay off workers' stretched timelines and accept that speed was killing readiness. When the recommendation reached Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, in August 1943, King called McCain into his office in Washington. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. No one else was present, but McCain's aide waiting outside later described hearing raised voices through the closed door. King's position was brutally simple. Japan had 9 carriers. America had 12 and building more every month. The mathematics of attrition demanded maximum production speed, because every month America did not have a carrier in the fight was a month Japan used to strengthen its defenses. Slowing production to match training was thinking backwards. You did not slow the factory to match the school. You fixed the school to match the factory. McCain pushed back. Numbers on paper meant nothing if carriers could not operate effectively. An Essex-class carrier with an untrained crew was $67 million of floating steel that could not hit targets, could not defend itself, and would get its 3,000 crew members killed the first time Japanese aircraft found it. The Japanese had spent years perfecting carrier operations. Their pilots could launch a full strike in 15 minutes. American crews on new Essex carriers were taking 45 minutes for the same evolution. In combat, that 30-minute gap was the difference between launching first and dying first. King listened. Then he said something that changed the trajectory of the war. He did not agree to slow production. Instead, he ordered the creation of a system that had never existed in any navy in history. A carrier crew training pipeline that could produce combat-ready crews as fast as shipyards produced carriers. And the man he assigned to build that pipeline was not an admiral. It was not even a Navy man originally. It was a former commercial airline operations manager named Captain Donald B. Duncan, who had joined the Navy Reserve in 1940 and had spent 2 years studying why some carrier crews performed brilliantly and others performed terribly. Duncan had discovered something that challenged every assumption about naval training. The difference between a good carrier crew and a bad carrier crew was not experience measured in years. It was standardization measured in procedures. Japanese carrier crews were excellent because they trained together for years on the same ship, developing intuitive coordination through repetition. But that model could not scale. If you needed 50 trained carrier crews in 2 years, you could not spend 3 years training each one. Duncan proposed a radical alternative. Instead of training crews as crews aboard their assigned carrier, he would break carrier operations into 167 discrete tasks. Each task would have a written procedure, a training module, and a qualification standard. Sailors would learn individual tasks at shore-based training facilities before ever setting foot on a carrier. When they reported aboard, they already knew their specific job. The crew did not need years of working together because every man was following the same standardized playbook. The Navy's old guard called this approach ridiculous. Carrier operations were an art, not a checklist. You could not reduce the complexity of launching and recovering aircraft in combat conditions to a series of written procedures. The instinct built through years of experience could not be taught in a classroom. A deck crew that had never worked together would freeze under fire, fumble under pressure, and get pilots killed through hesitation and confusion. Duncan did not argue philosophy. He asked for one chance to prove the concept. In October 1943, he was given USS Bunker Hill as his test case. Bunker Hill had commissioned in May with a crew that was 70% first-time sailors. Her performance during initial training had been mediocre. Aircraft handling was slow. Flight operations were sloppy. The ship's captain had submitted a report stating Bunker Hill needed 6 more months of training before she was combat ready. Duncan requested 3 weeks, not 6 months. 3 weeks. He would retrain Bunker Hill's crew using his standardized task system and demonstrate that the carrier could meet combat readiness standards in 21 days. The Navy gave him his 3 weeks. They also assigned 3 senior captains as observers with instructions to evaluate whether Duncan's methods produced genuine readiness or dangerous illusion. Duncan arrived aboard Bunker Hill on October 4th, 1943, with a team of 12 instructors and 14,000 pages of procedure manuals covering every task performed aboard an Essex-class carrier. The crew looked at the manuals and looked at Duncan's team and saw men who had never served on carriers telling them how to run their ship using books. The first 3 days were chaos. Duncan's team evaluated every crew member on their assigned tasks using standardized checklists. The results were devastating. Of 840 rated positions critical to flight operations, only 212 were filled by personnel who could pass basic task proficiency evaluations. 75% of the crew could not perform their assigned jobs to minimum standard. Duncan posted the results publicly on the ship's bulletin boards, not to humiliate, to demonstrate the gap between where the crew was and where they needed to be. Day 4 through day 10. Intensive task, specific training. Each sailor focused exclusively on their individual responsibilities. Deck handlers practiced aircraft spotting, using painted outlines on the hangar deck, until they could position planes with 6-inch precision in total darkness. Fueling crews rehearsed aviation, gasoline procedures until every connection, every valve, every safety check became automatic. Ordnance teams loaded and unloaded practice ammunition until handling times dropped from 14 minutes per aircraft to 6 minutes. Day 11. The first integrated flight operations exercise. Aircraft launched and recovered in sequence, while all departments coordinated simultaneously. The exercise was a mess. Communications broke down between the flight deck and the air boss. 2 aircraft were spotted incorrectly blocking the catapults. Recovery operations ran 12 minutes behind schedule. The observers took notes and exchanged glances that said what everyone was thinking. This is not working. Duncan reviewed the failures that night with his team. Every breakdown traced to handoff points between departments, where one team's procedures interfaced with another team's procedures. The individual tasks were being performed correctly. The connections between tasks were failing. Duncan spent the night rewriting 32 interface procedures and briefed the crew at 0500 the next morning, day 12 through day 17. Integrated exercises repeated daily with increasing complexity. Night operations, foul weather procedures, emergency recovery of damaged aircraft, Each exercise exposed new interface failures. Each failure generated a procedure revision. By day 15, the revision slowed. The system was stabilizing. On day 16, Bunker Hill launched a full strike package of 36 aircraft, recovered them, rearmed, and refueled all 36, and relaunched them in 2 hours and 41 minutes. The pre-Duncan time for the same evolution had been 4 hours and 12 minutes. A 36% improvement in 15 days. Day 18 through 21. Full combat simulation. Bunker Hill conducted 72 hours of continuous flight operations, simulating sustained combat conditions. Aircraft launched every 90 minutes. Crews rotated through watch schedules. Simulated battle damage required emergency procedures. At the end of 72 hours, Bunker Hill had launched and recovered over 200 sorties with 0 deck crashes, 0 fueling incidents, and 0 ordnance accidents. Her launch cycle time was 19 minutes from signal to last aircraft airborne. Japanese carriers averaged 15 minutes. The gap had shrunk from 30 minutes to 4. The 3 observer captains submitted their evaluation. Bunker Hill met combat readiness standards across all measured categories. The standardized task training system produced measurable, verifiable improvements in crew performance that exceeded anything achieved through traditional extended training periods. The recommendation was unanimous. Implement Duncan system across all Essex-class carriers immediately. But success in controlled training was one thing. Success in combat, where Japanese pilots were shooting back and kamikaze aircraft were diving at your flight deck, was something entirely different. And the first test came faster than anyone expected. In November 1943, Bunker Hill deployed to the Pacific as part of Task Force 58 for Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. She joined Essex and Independence in a 3-carrier task group, the largest carrier concentration America had attempted since Midway. The operation would prove whether Duncan's rapid training methods produced crews that could fight or crews that would crumble when real bombs started falling. On November 19th, Bunker Hill launched her first combat strike against Japanese positions on Tarawa. 32 aircraft launched in 17 minutes. The strike destroyed 4 coastal defense guns and 2 ammunition depots. Recovery operations brought all aircraft back aboard with no deck incidents. The crew performed exactly as trained. Every task executed by the checklist. Every handoff between departments smooth and precise. Over the following week, Bunker Hill flew 173 combat sorties, supporting the Tarawa landings. She operated continuously for 5 days. Her crew, 70% of whom had never been to sea 7 months earlier, performed at a level indistinguishable from veteran carrier crews. Japanese aircraft attacked the task group twice. Bunker Hill's Combat Air Patrol, directed by radar operators trained under Duncan's standardized system, intercepted both attacks and splashed 6 Japanese aircraft. When the after-action reports reached Washington, Admiral King circled one statistic and sent it to every shipyard building Essex-class carriers. Bunker Hill, trained in 21 days using standardized methods, had achieved a sortie generation rate of 34 sorties per day. U.S. Saratoga, a veteran carrier with a crew that had been together for over 2 years, averaged 31 sorties per day during the same operation. The new system did not just match experienced crews. It exceeded them by 10%. Duncan's training pipeline was implemented across the fleet in December 1943. Every new Essex-class carrier commissioning from that point forward received a Duncan-trained crew that reached combat readiness within 3 weeks of departure from the shipyard. The bottleneck McCain had identified was gone. Carriers could now be built, crew-trained, and deployed at the speed the shipyards could produce them. 1 carrier every 8 weeks, each one combat-ready within a month of commissioning each one, adding 90 aircraft to America's growing armada. By June 1944, 15 carriers operated as Task Force 58 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. 15 carriers with crews trained in weeks performing at levels that Japanese naval officers who had trained for decades could not match. 956 aircraft against Japan's 450. The result was so one-sided that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. American losses, 29 planes. Japanese Admiral Ozawa sailed into that battle, believing he faced 11 or 12 American carriers. He faced 15. And every single one of them operated with lethal precision because a former airline manager had figured out how to train carrier crews, the way factories trained assembly line workers. Standardized, systematized, scalable. But the Philippine Sea was June. Leyte Gulf was October. And in those 4 months, something happened that would make the Philippine Sea look like a skirmish. 2 more Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. Then 2 more. American carrier strength did not just grow, it multiplied. And Japanese intelligence, already struggling to count carriers that appeared faster than their estimates allowed, was about to face a nightmare they could not classify, could not report, and could not admit to their own commanders. Because when 17 Essex-class carriers appeared at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese Navy did not just face a larger enemy fleet. They faced proof that everything they believed about industrial warfare, about the limits of mass production, about the impossibility of building a navy in 3 years, was wrong. And in Part 3, we will stand on the bridge of the Yamato with Admiral Kurita as 250 aircraft tear his fleet apart in 6 hours as the super battleship Musashi absorbs 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before rolling over and taking 1,000 men to the bottom. And as Kurita makes the decision that historians will debate for 80 years. The decision to turn around. Not because he lacked courage, but because he finally understood what he was fighting against. An enemy that did not just build weapons faster. An enemy that built entire systems faster, training systems, production systems, logistic systems. And no amount of Japanese courage could defeat a system that replaced everything it lost before the smoke cleared. Part 3 is where the killing begins. And it does not stop until the Japanese Navy ceases to exist. In Part 1, a shipbuilder named William Francis Gibbs brought mass production methods to carrier construction, cutting build times from 20 months to 13 months, while 5 shipyards worked simultaneously. In Part 2, Captain Donald Duncan solved the crew training crisis by creating a standardized system that turned raw recruits into combat-ready sailors in 21 days. By June 1944, 15 Essex-class carriers operated as Task Force 58 and annihilated Japanese carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea. The factory was running. The training pipeline was flowing. American carrier strength was growing by 1 new flat top every 8 weeks. And across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence was about to suffer a nervous breakdown. Because by September 1944, reconnaissance aircraft returning to Japanese bases in the Philippines carried photographs that made intelligence officers physically ill. Photographs showing American carrier task groups so large that analysts ran out of identification markers trying to count individual ships. The number they kept arriving at was impossible. 17 fleet carriers in one theater at one time. Japanese pre-war estimates had predicted 8 to 10 American carriers total by mid-1944. The actual number was 260% higher, and the men responsible for counting enemy ships had no idea how to tell their commanders the truth. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received intelligence briefings throughout September 1944 that painted a picture growing darker by the week. American carrier aircraft had been striking Japanese airfields across the Philippines since early September. The raids were relentless. Waves of Hellcat fighters swept in at dawn, destroyed aircraft on the ground, cratered runways, and burned fuel depots. Before Japanese repair crews could fill the craters, another wave arrived. Then another. The tempo was inhuman. In the first 2 weeks of September alone, American carrier strikes destroyed over 500 Japanese aircraft in the Philippines. 500 aircraft in 14 days. Japan's entire monthly aircraft production for the Navy was approximately 600 planes. The Americans were destroying aircraft faster than Japan could build them, and they were doing it from carriers that Japanese admirals had dismissed as mass-produced junk 2 years earlier. Japanese air commanders in the Philippines sent increasingly desperate reports to Tokyo. They were losing the air war before the ground invasion even began. Every morning brought fresh American strikes. Every evening brought damage assessments showing fewer operational aircraft, fewer trained pilots, fewer serviceable airfields. By the end of September, Japanese air strength in the Philippines had been reduced from approximately 800 aircraft to fewer than 200. The Americans had achieved air superiority over an entire archipelago using carrier-based aviation alone. Toyota understood what the numbers meant. When the Americans invaded the Philippines, and they would invade soon, Japanese ground forces would fight without air cover. Without air cover, the invasion fleet would be untouchable. Without an untouchable invasion fleet, the Philippines would fall. And without the Philippines, Japan's supply lines to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies would be severed permanently. The situation demanded a response so extreme that when Toyota proposed it to the Naval General Staff, several officers argued it was suicide. Operation Shogo, the decisive battle plan. Every remaining warship in the Japanese Navy would converge on the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf in a coordinated three-pronged attack designed to destroy the amphibious transports before they could land enough troops to secure the beachheads. The plan required Vice Admiral Ozawa's remaining 4 carriers to sail south from Japan as a decoy, deliberately sacrificing themselves to draw American fleet carriers away from Leyte Gulf. While the Americans chased Ozawa north, Vice Admiral Kurita's battleship force, including Yamato and Musashi, would transit San Bernardino Strait and attack the invasion fleet from the east. Simultaneously, Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force would push through Surigao Strait and attack from the south. It was a plan built on desperation and one critical assumption: the decoy would work. American carriers would chase Ozawa. Kurita's battleships would reach Leyte Gulf unopposed. But this was not the only crisis threatening the operation. Inside the Japanese Navy itself, the intelligence failures surrounding American carrier strength had created a fracture that no one dared discuss openly. Captain Toshikazu Omai, the same officer who had warned about American carrier production in 1942, was now serving on the Combined Fleet Operations Staff. He had seen the July 1944 intelligence reassessment that confirmed 26 American carriers operational in the Pacific. He knew the briefings being given to Kurita and Nishimura cited 4 to 5 enemy carriers in Philippine waters. He knew those briefings were lies, not mistakes, not outdated estimates. Deliberate lies constructed by senior officers who had classified the true intelligence assessment above top secret and restricted its distribution to fewer than 30 people. Omei faced an impossible choice: report the true intelligence to operational commanders and face court-martial for violating classification orders, or stay silent and watch those commanders sail into a battle where they would face 3 times the enemy strength they expected. He chose silence. Not out of cowardice, but out of institutional paralysis. The system that created the lie was the same system that punished anyone who challenged it. Omei would carry that silence for the rest of his life. And so, on October 22, 1944, Vice Admiral Kurita departed Brunei with 23 warships, believing he would face 4 or 5 American carriers. The real number waiting for him was 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, plus 6 light carriers, plus 18 escort carriers, 41 carriers in total, the most concentrated naval aviation force ever assembled in the history of warfare. October 24, 1944, the Sibuyan Sea. 10:26 a.m. Kurita's lookouts spot aircraft approaching from the east. Small dots at first, then dozens. Then the sky fills. The first wave is from Task Group 38.2, dive bombers from USS Intrepid and USS Cabot. They come in high-rolling into near-vertical dives at 12,000 feet, releasing 500-pound bombs that scream through the humid air and slam into Japanese warships below. The heavy cruiser, Miyoko, takes a torpedo to her stern. Her propellers stop. She falls out of formation, dead in the water. Kurita orders evasive maneuvers. 22 remaining ships scatter across the sea, each captain choosing his own survival path. Anti-aircraft guns fill the sky with black puffs of flak. Tracers arc upward in bright streams. It does not matter. There are too many aircraft. They come from every direction. 11:15 a.m. The second wave arrives. This time from Task Group 38.3, aircraft from USS Essex and USS Lexington. Torpedo bombers approach Musashi from port and starboard simultaneously, forcing the super battleship to choose which torpedoes to dodge and which to absorb. She turns to port. 2 torpedoes hit her starboard side. She turns to starboard. 3 more hit her port side. Water floods forward compartments. Her bow settles lower. 12:30 p.m. Third wave. Task Group 38.4 launches from USS Franklin and USS Enterprise. More dive bombers. More torpedo planes. Musashi has now taken 10 torpedoes and 7 bombs. She is slowing. Listing. Her damage control teams are pumping water faster than it floods in. But they are losing the race. One of her engine rooms is flooded. Speed drops from 24 knots to 20, then 16, then 12. 1:45 p.m. Fourth wave. Aircraft from carriers that have already struck once are returning. They have landed rearmed, refueled, and launched again in under 2 hours. The cycle time Duncan's training system produced. 19 minutes to launch. 40 minutes to fly to target. 20 minutes over target. 40 minutes to return. 30 minutes to rearm and refuel. Total cycle, under 3 hours. The Americans are generating continuous strikes faster than Kurita's ships can repair damage from the previous strike. Musashi takes 4 more torpedoes. Her list increases to 12 degrees. Counter-flooding corrects it partially, but she is sinking by the bow now. Her forward turret is underwater to the gun ports. Speed drops to 6 knots. She cannot keep up with the fleet. 3:20 p.m. Fifth wave. Kurita watches from Yamato's bridge 300 yards ahead. Musashi is surrounded by waterspouts from near-miss bombs and torpedo tracks, crisscrossing through the water around her hull. She takes 2 more torpedoes. Then, 3 bombs in rapid succession that penetrate her upper deck and explode deep inside the ship, rupturing steam lines and killing engineering crews in compartments that were supposed to be safe behind the thickest armor any warship ever carried. 4:15 p.m. Musashi stops. 70,000 tons of steel motionless in the water, listing 20 degrees to port. Down by the bow, so far that waves wash over her forward deck. The order is given. Abandon ship. Men pour over the sides into oil-slicked water. Some are burned. Some are wounded. Some simply cannot swim. Over 1,000 men will die with the ship. At 7:35 p.m., Musashi rolls to port and capsizes. Her keel points at the sky for several minutes before she slides beneath the surface, taking 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits.
The grave. The most heavily armored warship ever built, destroyed by mass-produced aircraft, launched from mass-produced carriers, crewed by men trained in 21 days. Kurita's staff compiles the day's damage assessment. 259 American aircraft sorties flown against his force in one afternoon. Musashi sunk. Heavy cruiser, Mayoka crippled. Multiple ships damaged by near misses and strafing. Kurita has lost 10% of his firepower before reaching San Bernardino Strait. That evening, long-range reconnaissance reports reach Kurita's flagship. 13 large carriers confirmed east of the Philippines.
Kurita requests clarification from Combined Fleet Headquarters. The response maintains the fiction. 4 to 5 carriers in the area. Kurita looks at the message. He looks at the sky, where 259 aircraft attacked him in 6 hours. He knows the message is wrong. He knows headquarters knows it is wrong. He says nothing. He continues west toward the strait. The news of Musashi's sinking reaches Tokyo within hours. Admiral Toyota receives the report and understands its implications with perfect clarity. The Americans sank the most powerful battleship in history using carrier aircraft alone. No surface engagement. No submarine torpedo, just wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes launched from carriers that Japanese intelligence said should not exist in those numbers. Toyota does not cancel the operation. He cannot. Ozawa's decoy force is already engaged with American carriers to the north. Nishimura's southern force is already transiting Surigao Strait. Cancellation now means the sacrifice of both forces for nothing. The operation continues because stopping is worse than failing. Across the Pacific Fleet, the destruction of Musashi sends a different message entirely. American carrier crews who participated in the strikes receive after-action reports showing their collective work sank an unsinkable battleship. The standardized training system that Duncan built did not just produce adequate crews. It produced crews that could coordinate multi-carrier strikes across 4 different task groups, attacking the same target over 8 hours with precision that overwhelmed the heaviest armor ever forged. The Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolds over the next 48 hours in 4 separate engagements. At Surigao Strait, Nishimura's southern force is annihilated in a textbook ambush. 2 battleships sunk, 3 destroyers sunk, Nishimura killed. In the north, Ozawa's decoy succeeds in drawing Admiral Halsey's carriers away from San Bernardino Strait. But the price is total destruction. All 4 Japanese carriers sunk. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, goes down with her flag flying. And off Samar Kurita's battleships emerge from San Bernardino Strait at dawn on October 25th to find 6 escort carriers defended by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The most lopsided surface engagement of the war. Kurita has 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers against ships designed to support amphibious landings, not fight fleet actions. He orders general attack. What happens next is studied in every naval academy on Earth. The destroyers and destroyer escorts charge Kurita's battleships, laying smokescreens and firing torpedoes at targets 50 times their size. The escort carriers launch every aircraft they have, the Wildcats and Avengers, loaded with whatever ordnance is available, making attack runs against battleships with weapons designed to hit ground targets. One destroyer escort, USS Samuel B. Roberts, closes to 4,000 yards of a heavy cruiser and fires her 5-inch guns into the cruiser's superstructure before taking a catastrophic hit that breaks her in half. Kurita watches this desperate defense and sees something that changes his mind. Aircraft appearing from the south, fleet aircraft, Hellcats and Helldivers from Task Force 38 carriers that Halsey has detached and sent racing back toward Leyte Gulf at maximum speed. The decoy did not work completely. The Americans had enough carriers to chase Ozawa and send strike groups back to protect the invasion fleet. Enough carriers. That phrase echoes through every Japanese calculation that failed. Enough carriers to strike Kurita in the Sibuyan Sea. Enough carriers to chase Ozawa north. Enough carriers to send back south. Enough carriers to protect the escort groups. Enough carriers to be everywhere simultaneously. Because when you have 17 fleet carriers and 24 more light and escort carriers, you do not face the agonizing choice between concentration and coverage that paralyzed Japanese planning. You simply cover everything, all the time, with force to spare. Kurita turns north at 9:11 a.m., then west. He retreats through San Bernardino Strait, pursued by carrier aircraft that harry his force for hours. 3 heavy cruisers lost, multiple destroyers damaged. The mission is a complete failure. When the final accounting of Leyte Gulf is compiled, the numbers tell a story of absolute industrial supremacy. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 28 warships. The Imperial Japanese Navy as a functional fighting force ceases to exist. American losses are 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort from the Samar engagement. The exchange ratio is 4-to-1 in ships, and over 10-to-1 in tonnage. 17 Essex-class carriers participated in the battle. 17 ships that Japanese admirals had mocked as mass-produced copies. 17 ships built in an average of 15 months each by 5 shipyards, using prefabrication methods that Japanese engineers called unsuitable for warships. 17 ships crewed by sailors trained in 3 weeks, using standardized procedures that Japanese officers called impossible. Those 17 carriers launched over 2,000 sorties during the 3 days of Leyte Gulf. They sank the most powerful battleship ever built. They destroyed the last of Japan's carrier force. They covered an invasion fleet of 700 ships. And when it was over, they were still operational, still launching aircraft, still controlling the sky over an ocean that Japan once called its own. Kurita returned to Japan in November 1944. He was reassigned to administrative duties and given no further commands. In his after-action report, he estimated facing at least 15 carriers. It was the most accurate assessment any Japanese commander had produced during the entire war. And it was filed alongside the classified intelligence report that confirmed American carrier strength exceeded everything Japan had ever imagined. But what happened to the men who made this possible? What happened to Gibbs, the shipbuilder who revolutionized construction? To Duncan, the airline manager who reinvented training? To the welders and electricians and pipefitters who built 17 fleet carriers in 3 years? And what happened to Captain Omei, the intelligence officer who knew the truth and stayed silent while thousands of men sailed into a battle they could not win? Their stories have one final chapter. A chapter about legacy, about guilt, about the price of industrial genius, and the cost of institutional cowardice. A chapter that most history books never tell, because it happened after the guns went silent in quiet rooms where old men remembered decisions that shaped the world. That final chapter comes in part 4. And it begins with a question that haunted every surviving Japanese admiral until the day they died. What if we had believed the numbers? What if we had understood that the enemy we mocked was building not just ships, but an entirely new way of waging war? The answer to that question is the most painful lesson of the Second World War. And it is coming next. A shipbuilder who had never built a warship revolutionized carrier construction. An airline manager who had never commanded a ship reinvented crew training. 5 shipyards and a 21-day pipeline produced 17 Essex-class fleet carriers that appeared at Leyte Gulf and destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy in 3 days. The factory worked. The system worked. The carriers worked. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers in the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. The war at sea was over. But what happened to the people who made it possible? What happened to the man who mocked mass production and the man who embraced it? What happened to the admiral who sailed into a lie and the intelligence officer who knew the truth but said nothing? Their stories have endings that no one expected. Because victory, it turns out, does not always reward the men who created it, and defeat does not always destroy the men who caused it. William Francis Gibbs never wore a uniform. He never received a military decoration. When the war ended in August 1945, the shipyards that had built 24 Essex-class carriers began shutting down carrier production lines within weeks. Workers who had welded hull sections 16 hours a day for 3 years received final paychecks and walked out of Newport News and Brooklyn and Philadelphia into a peacetime economy that had no use for men who built warships. Gibbs watched the dismantling of the production system he had helped create with a mixture of pride and frustration that he carried for the rest of his life. The Navy never officially acknowledged Gibbs's contribution to carrier construction methods. His name does not appear in any official Navy history of the Essex-class program. The techniques he pioneered, prefabrication of hull modules, parallel assembly of ship sections, systematic welding replacing riveting, were adopted so completely that they became invisible. They were simply how ships were built. No one remembered that someone had to fight to prove they would work. Gibbs continued designing ships after the war. His masterpiece was the SS United States, a passenger liner that captured the blue ribbon for fastest Atlantic crossing in 1952. She was built using the same prefabrication methods Gibbs had championed for carriers. The ship that proved mass production techniques could create not just adequate vessels, but extraordinary ones. Gibbs died in 1967 at age 81. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned the SS United States. It did not mention Essex-class carriers. Captain Donald Duncan received the Navy Cross for his contributions to carrier operations training. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1945. But the standardized training system he created, the 167 discrete tasks, the 3-week pipeline that turned civilians into combat-ready sailors, was quietly dismantled after the war. Peacetime Navy leadership reverted to traditional training methods. Extended workup periods, learning by doing. The old way. Duncan protested. He wrote memoranda arguing that standardized training methods should be preserved as institutional knowledge for future mobilization. The memoranda were filed. They were not acted upon. When the Korean War began in 1950, the Navy scrambled to recommission mothballed carriers and train new crews. The process took months longer than it should have, because Duncan's training system no longer existed. Officers who remembered the system tried to recreate it from memory. Some succeeded partially. Most did not. Duncan, now retired, was not consulted. He learned about the Korean War carrier mobilization from newspaper reports and spent an afternoon in his study writing a letter to the Chief of Naval Operations that he never sent. The letter said simply that everything the Navy was struggling to rebuild in 1950 had existed in 1944 and been destroyed by institutional amnesia. Duncan died in 1971. His Navy Cross citation praised his wartime service in general terms. It did not specifically mention the training system that made 17 carrier crews combat-ready in time for Leyte Gulf. Henry Kaiser, the man whose cargo ship methods inspired carrier construction techniques, became one of the wealthiest industrialists in post-war America. He built automobiles, aluminum plants, and hospitals. He founded Kaiser Permanente, the healthcare organization that still bears his name. Of all the men involved in the carrier production miracle, Kaiser alone achieved lasting public recognition, but not for shipbuilding. The escort carriers his yards produced 118 in total, were scrapped or sold within a decade of the war's end. Kaiser never spoke publicly about his wartime shipbuilding with particular pride. To him, ships were just another product. The methods were what mattered, and those methods had applications far beyond warfare. Across the Pacific, the fates of Japanese officers who had participated in the intelligence catastrophe followed darker paths. Admiral Suemu Toyota, who ordered the Shogo operation, knowing his commanders were being sent into battle with false intelligence about enemy strength, was tried as a war criminal after Japan's surrender. He was acquitted in 1949. The tribunal concluding that his operational decisions, while disastrous, did not constitute criminal conduct. Toyota lived until 1957, never publicly discussing the intelligence failures that doomed the Leyte Gulf operation. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the man who turned his battleships around off Samar when he realized American carrier strength made his mission impossible, became the most controversial figure in Japanese naval history. Critics called him a coward who abandoned his mission when victory was within reach. Defenders argued he made the only rational decision available to a commander who discovered his intelligence was wrong by a factor of 3. Kurita himself spoke rarely about the battle. In a private conversation recorded by a family member in 1965, Kurita said that the moment he understood Japanese intelligence about American carriers was catastrophically wrong, was the moment he understood the war was lost. Not losing. Lost. Past tense, every order given after that moment was an order to die for nothing. He chose not to give that order. Kurita died in 1977 at age 88. He never received official vindication from the Japanese government. He never sought it. Captain Toshikazu Omai, the intelligence officer who warned about American carrier production in 1942, and then stayed silent when false briefings were given to operational commanders before Leyte Gulf, cooperated extensively with American occupation authorities after the war. He provided detailed accounts of Japanese intelligence failures to U.S. naval intelligence officers, compiling lessons learned studies. His testimony filled hundreds of pages. In those accounts, Omai described the institutional paralysis that prevented accurate intelligence from reaching the men who needed it. He used a phrase that American intelligence analysts would quote for decades afterward. He called it the tyranny of acceptable conclusions. Intelligence was not evaluated on accuracy. It was evaluated on whether it supported decisions that leadership had already made. When the truth contradicted those decisions, the truth was classified and the decisions continued. Omai lived until 1985. He spent his final years writing a private memoir that was never published. His family donated it to the Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies after his death. The memoir's final paragraph contained a single question, written in Omai's careful handwriting. How many men died because I did not speak? But the real legacy of the Essex-class carrier program was not personal. It was systemic, and its influence extended far beyond World War II, into every conflict and every military organization that followed. The Essex-class carriers themselves served for decades after the war. 14 of the 24 ships built were modernized in the 1950s, with angled flight decks, steam catapults, and mirror landing systems that allowed them to operate jet aircraft. USS Essex served in the Korean War. USS Bonhomme Richard deployed to Vietnam. USS Hornet recovered the Apollo 11 astronauts after the first moon landing in 1969. The ship's Gibbs helped build faster than anyone thought possible, lasted 40 years in active service, because mass production did not mean inferior production. It meant efficient production. The carriers were well-designed, well-built, and well-maintained. They simply came into existence faster than traditional methods allowed. The construction methods pioneered during the Essex program became the foundation of modern naval shipbuilding worldwide. Every aircraft carrier built since 1945, American, British, French, Russian, Chinese, Indian, uses prefabrication techniques descended from the methods Newport News developed under wartime pressure. Hull sections built in parallel. Modular construction of internal compartments, welded joints replacing riveted joints. The revolution Gibbs fought for became so universal that modern shipbuilders cannot imagine building any other way. Duncan's standardized training concept, though abandoned after World War II, was reinvented independently by every major navy that operated carriers in the following decades. The U.S. Navy formalized it as the Fleet Training Group System in the 1960s. The Royal Navy adopted similar methods for its Invincible-class carriers. The principle that complex operations could be broken into discrete, trainable tasks and taught systematically rather than absorbed through years of experience, became the foundation of modern military training doctrine across all services. Every time a military organization creates a training pipeline that converts civilians into specialists in weeks rather than years, it is following the path Duncan blazed in 1943. The broader lesson of the Essex carrier program extended beyond military applications into industrial philosophy itself. The idea that complex products could be built faster through systematic methods rather than artisanal craftsmanship influenced post-war manufacturing across every industry. Toyota's production system, the foundation of modern lean manufacturing, drew explicitly on American wartime production methods, including shipyard prefabrication techniques. The Japanese, ironically, became the world's greatest practitioners of the mass production philosophy that had defeated them, applying it to automobiles, electronics, and consumer goods, with results that transformed the global economy. But the deepest lesson of the Essex-class story was not about ships or factories or training systems. It was about the catastrophic cost of institutional self-deception. The Japanese Navy did not lose because it lacked brave men, or capable ships, or talented commanders. It lost because its institutional culture made it impossible to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about enemy capabilities. Intelligence that contradicted strategic assumptions was suppressed. Officers who raised concerns were silenced. Operational plans were built on numbers that everyone in authority privately knew were wrong, but no one could officially challenge. This pattern of institutional failure did not die with the Imperial Japanese Navy. It recurred in every major military disaster of the 20th century. French generals in 1940 who dismissed warnings about German armored tactics because those tactics contradicted established doctrine. American commanders in Vietnam who reported enemy strength figures that supported optimistic narratives rather than battlefield reality. Soviet military planners who ignored evidence of technological gaps because acknowledging those gaps would embarrass political leadership. The tyranny of acceptable conclusions that Omai described was not a Japanese weakness. It was a human weakness. An organizational disease that infected any institution where telling the truth carried greater personal risk than maintaining a comfortable lie. And there is one final detail about this story that most people have never heard. A detail that emerged from declassified documents released by the National Archives in 2001, 57 years after the battle. In September 1944, 1 month before Leyte Gulf, a Japanese submarine operating in the Philippine Sea surfaced at night to transmit a reconnaissance report. The submarine's captain had spent 3 days observing American carrier task groups transiting toward the Philippines. He counted the carriers carefully, multiple times, confirming his count against ship identification profiles. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters listed 16 large carriers and 9 smaller carriers operating in 3 task groups. 16 fleet carriers. The report was almost perfectly accurate. The actual number at that time was 17 Essex-class carriers, with 1 additional carrier completing its transit from Pearl Harbor. The report reached Combined Fleet Headquarters on September 28, 1944. 24 days before Kurita sailed from Brunei with intelligence briefings telling him to expect 4 to 5 enemy carriers. The submarine captain's report was reviewed by the intelligence staff. It was compared against existing estimates of American carrier strength. It was flagged as inconsistent with accepted intelligence assessments. And it was filed, classified, locked in a safe, and never forwarded to any operational commander. The submarine captain, who risked his life surfacing in enemy-controlled waters to transmit the most accurate intelligence report the Japanese Navy received during the entire Philippine campaign, was never told his report had been suppressed. He died 2 months later when his submarine was sunk by American destroyers off Formosa. His name was Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Fujimura. He was 34 years old. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Yokohama, who received notification of his death in January 1945, without ever knowing that their husband and father had tried to save the fleet and been silenced by the men who were supposed to listen. Fujimura's suppressed report sat in the Combined Fleet archives until American occupation forces seized Japanese naval records in September 1945. It was catalogued, translated, and filed in the U.S. National Archives, where it remained unnoticed for 56 years until a graduate student researching Japanese submarine operations discovered it in 2001 and published her findings in the Naval War College Review. The discovery did not change any historical conclusions about Leyte Gulf. The outcome would have been the same regardless of whether Kurita knew about 17 carriers or believed there were 5. Japan could not have won that battle. But Fujimura's report proved something that Omai had described in his unpublished memoir. Oh, the truth was available. It was collected. It was accurate. And it was deliberately buried because it did not match what leadership wanted to believe. From a shipbuilder who never built a warship to a training system invented by an airline manager. From 5 shipyards working day and night to 17 fleet carriers appearing on the horizon at Leyte Gulf. A submarine captain who counted the truth and was silenced to an intelligence officer who knew the truth and could not speak. This is the story of how mass production won the carrier war, not through superior design, not through individual brilliance, through volume, through systems, through the industrial philosophy that adequate capability
multiplied by overwhelming quantity defeats elite capability every single time. 24 Essex-class carriers, 118 escort carriers, 151 carriers total against Japan's 9. The numbers were not close. They were never going to be close. And the moment Japanese admirals stopped mocking those numbers and started counting, the war was already over. Lieutenant Commander Fujimura counted 16 carriers from the periscope of a submarine in September 1944 and sent the truth to men who refused to hear it.
Somewhere in Yokohama, his 2 daughters grew old without knowing their father tried to change the course of a battle that was lost before it began. Not lost because Japan lacked courage. Lost because one nation built ships like a factory, builds machines, trained crews like a school trained students, and produced carriers faster than the enemy could count them. That is the power of systems over heroism. That is the lesson of the Essex-class. And that is why 80 years later, the welding torches at Newport News still matter, more than every samurai sword ever forged. If you know another story where one insane idea changed the course of a war, share it in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of innovations that shaped World War II. Subscribe to hear the rest. Because history is full of ordinary people who did extraordinary things that nobody believed were possible, until the impossible was already done.